Yeah, so I think I, like many other people, had assumed that the leaders of these cartels were naturally kind of selfish capitalists who attempted to kind of monopolize the traffic of drugs throughout Mexico. So you would have the Sinaloa cartel that would fight the Gulf cartel for control of trafficking through a particular area. But one thing that I found looking at the history of the trade is that basically most of the time, drug traffickers cooperate, basically because drug trafficking necessitates basically networks of people that will traffic the drugs through particular routes. Now, what I found out over the last kind of 20 years or so, which seems upshoot in what looks like cartel violence, it is often either the DEA or the federal Mexican authorities that are managing to basically divide the cartels against one another, principally by catching somebody like Chapo and forcing Chapo to rat out another part of his group, another wing of his cartel. So they would effectively create these breaks in cartels by using informants and then wedge open these divisions. And in actual fact, the DEA had a term for it. They called it divide and conquer. So what looks like these cartels at each other's throats over the drug trade is often them fighting the DEA's own wars for them. I think this was, to me, was the most shocking, really.
I mean, that to me is just sort of fascinating insofar as like that is a strategy where they get them fighting amongst each other, because there's no evidence that in any way weakens the industry, does it? I mean, it sort of feels like what is the value of that ultimately? Well, I mean, I guess this is sort of the point of the book too. On some of us,
I mean, it's a really good question. But basically, the point of it is the DEA can go and give a PowerPoint presentation to other people in Washington saying, "Look, classically between 2012 and 2018, Mexico arrested 130, were arrested or killed, or were killed 130 out of 140 so-called kingpins, and the DEA's budget increased commensurately during those 6 years, and did the budget of the federal police in Mexico, and did the budget of the army as well in Mexico. What did this actually do to drug addiction? Absolutely nothing. In actual fact, the price of coke and heroin went down during that period, and the amount of people overdosing on US streets went up during that period. So the DEA has never really had any real interest in overdoses or the ease of getting drugs in America. What it is very good at is selling its war as a victory, and showing these kind of dead capos and Chapo in jail was good publicity.
Well, then it doesn't make it necessarily functionally different than any one of the wars that the United States is waging throughout other areas of the globe. You can just see this as an extension of U.S. empire, except you can make drugs the amorphous enemy as budgets go up and people get to feel like they're warriors for the good empire, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's got a lot of parallels with the kind of war on terrorism. This kind of amorphous enemy that you can never really conquer, that you continually name, right? You continually have these dreadful terrorists that are manipulating everything, that are pulling all the puppet strings. Then you get rid of them. Then you sell that as a success, but you still have to wage the war on terrorism. So you still need the budget to be increased. And it's very similar with the war on drugs.
Let's talk about the back in the 60s.
It's getting dark here. I'm going to put the light on, if that's all right.
Oh, definitely.
Yes. And if maybe you could just tilt your camera just a little bit, maybe just angle it so that the light's not behind you directly.
Yes, that's better. Is that better?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great. So in the 60s, the drug business gets professionalized by a guy named Pedro Aviles Perez. That is presumed, or at least I guess the legend was that he was El Chapo's godfather. But that was not, I don't know if that was really apocryphal or what. But how did they professionalize? Like at that point, like what does that mean to professionalize it?
Yeah, so effectively, rather than the traffickers being really kind of small-scale operators that would essentially have a network of kind of maybe 5, 10, mostly family members that actually knew the people who were growing the opium poppies, often either were or knew the chemists personally. They were family members who were making that opium into heroin, and then knew the people who had a kind of stash house on the border. Maybe another family member who would actually traffic the stuff across. Now, what this man, Pedro Avilés Perez, does is he does two things. Essentially, one, he brings together marijuana and heroin trafficking that up to that point to be completely separate. And he creates this huge network of border warehouses where he stores weed and heroin from all over Mexico. So if you're a trafficker down in southern Mexico, you come out to his warehouses, sell to him, and he smuggles the stuff over the border. And he has a fleet of aeroplanes. So I suppose he is the modern version of what becomes known as a kingpin. So he is, I think, pretty responsible for this kind of modernization of the trade. And you're right, there are certain myths that he was the godfather of Chapo. He knew Chapo. I don't think necessarily that's true. I think Chapo did have relatives involved in the trade, but the principal one being a guy called Silvino Guzman. I don't think Pedro Avilés was very close to him.
And it was around that time, maybe a little bit later, that that dynamic with state police and state institutions being sort of like collecting these black market tax sort of it becomes federal at that point, that the Mexican federal government essentially starts to maintain that same dynamic with drug dealers. Give us a sense of, like, when we talk about this drug trade, and I imagine it's shifted. Well, and I know it's shifted over the years, but what are we talking about in terms of like pot versus heroin versus cocaine? I mean, what is the dynamic there? Is it just simply when the U.S. cracks down on heroin, coke sales go up? When the U.S. cracks down on pot, heroin goes. Is that basically how it works?
Pretty much. I kind of term it's the kind of emergency supplier for the United States. So when basically drugs are not easily available from another place, Mexico will provide for them. So there are times when you're right, marijuana isn't selling terribly well from Mexico because there's better quality stuff from Jamaica or Colombia during the late 1970s. But then as soon as that supply is closed down, Mexico steps in. Again, Mexican heroin is not thought of as terribly good during the 1970s. So they get most of the stuff from either Thailand or from, essentially from kind of France, from Turkey via France. But when those are closed down, again, Mexico steps in with kind of Mexican mud or kind of brown Mexican heroin. So yeah, it's a kind of emergency supply. And so it's always produced weed, it's always produced heroin and morphine, and it's always been a key transshipment point for cocaine. There was, late 90s, it was trafficking somewhere in the region of 95% of America's cocaine, and America was taking about 70% of the world's cocaine. So there was a lot of coke.
We were really number one. That was not.
Yeah. You've lost out now to Brazil and Western Europe. So I think that was as a victory.